Yipes. I talked to Emily about the Bible study that's been going on, and she said that lots of people had questions about the formation of the canon and just sort of how the Bible came to be. So that we could talk a tiny bit about that. If I can keep from spilling coffee on my microphone, the microphone feeding back, all these things. So, in the very early days, if you went to a synagogue service, it might look something like this. You might have a series of prayers, you might have psalms that are sung, and then someone would get up and read from the Torah, one of the scrolls of the Torah. What those would look like, so you have the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, which would be universal in synagogues, but then the other books that they had in that Jewish canon, this thing is, I feel like it's just poised to like start screeching and sounding terrible. I wonder if there's something I can do. That's a good idea. Hey. Not something that rabbis in the first century had to deal with. So, you go to, am I okay, Mary? Can you hear me through this mic? Awesome. So you go to a synagogue, and there are prayers, there are the singing of psalms, someone stands up and takes a scroll out of the ark. The ark was like a cabinet or a basket where all the scrolls of the Torah were stored. There are no books in a first century synagogue. It's just these big papyrus or maybe vellum scrolls. And so someone stands up and gives a reading, and then someone else stands up and talks about that, a sermon. Then you have some more prayers, and then everybody goes home. Does that sound sort of familiar, like a familiar format? Yeah, because we are totally intellectual property thieves. It's all stolen from Judaism. We're just a subset of Judaism. So, in the early church, when you go to the liturgy of the word, you have some prayers, you have some singing of psalms, someone gets up and they read an Old Testament lesson, and then someone talks about it. The difference between what we have today and what you would have in the first century is that someone would be called something like Matthew or Mark or Luke or John or Jude or Peter or James. You actually have one of the apostles, one of the disciples, one of these great luminaries of the church who has come from Jerusalem after the Pentecost and come to your little town of Ephesus or Corinth or Colossae or whatever it is, and is actually leading that community and giving the sermon each Sunday. So rather than a sermon on Torah in and of itself, how you apply the law of God to your own life, they would be connecting Torah with the one who they believed gave the Torah, Jesus Christ, the Word of God. And so you would have this beautiful illumination by St. Matthew or by St. Luke or by St. John or St. Paul or whomever. And people began to say, somebody should write this stuff down. This stuff is really good. We now live in this written culture. So if I make some outrageous claim today, Elvis wrote the 6th gospel and we should still be using that one, whatever, you would say, I need a reference for that. And I say, oh yeah, look at the Oxford Introduction to Christianity. You might say, well, that's a weird claim, but I guess serious scholars believe this stuff. But you would actually want some sort of citation, something peer-reviewed, something that's actually written down and substantial. The first century was not that. It was an oral culture. So writing something down, was insanely costly. There's a contemporary scholar who has estimated that to make a copy of the Book of Romans in the first century would cost about $5,000. That's a short book. You can read Romans in 45 minutes or something, less if you're a speedy reader. And so it was a costly thing. It was also not a society in which the majority of people could read. So you had to have wealth to buy texts. You also had to have education to read texts. And even more than that, there's an ancient suspicion of the written word. So Plato talks about how dangerous it is that writing is coming to replace teaching, is coming to replace memorization. And there's this sense that if I come to you and I say, tell me about cardiology, and you start telling me about cardiology, and I say, okay, so it's the science of looking at feet, and you say, no, you weren't listening. Cardiology is about the heart. Here's what cardiology is. Then my error can be corrected. But if I'm just sort of skimming your text, then I may walk away with some absurd impression. So in Judaism, the majority of teaching happened between teacher and disciple, one-on-one or in groups. It might be rabbi to rabbi. It might be rabbi to a small Torah study group. It might be rabbi to entire congregation. But in this oral culture, oral teaching was what it was all about. So the books of the New Testament initially are written down not so that you can go to Barnes & Noble and get your own copy and read through it at your leisure. They're actually written down to be read in the context of the liturgy. So all the debates about what's in the canon, these are not debates about what do we put in the big book. These are debates about what do we read in the context of the liturgy of the Eucharist, on Sundays, during weekdays, and so forth. What is in the lectionary? So the earliest documents we have in the New Testament are Paul's letters. And I'm not going to identify who it is, but I have a special monitor in the room who's going to tell me if I'm going too quickly. Just whoever you are, what do you think? So far? Okay, good. Well, keep on me, please. So Paul's letters, there is something, we have two traditions in how to look at Paul's letters. So from at least the middle of the 200s on, there was this absolute certainty in the church that the author of the letters of Paul was a guy named Paul of Tarsus. And this goes along into the late early 1800s, at which time people start applying what they call the historical critical method to these letters. And they start comparing them, and they start saying, look, we have a letter like Romans, which we certainly know Paul wrote, Romans and Galatians. He had to have written those because we are German scholars, and those are the basis for Lutheran theology. So those are authentic, no question. You have to have those. That's everything to Lutherans. So you have Romans and Galatians, which Paul undoubtedly wrote, and then they compare them to a letter like Ephesians, and they start noticing differences in the way he uses words, in the way he addresses people, and the way the whole thing is constructed. And then they compare that to Colossians. Oh my gosh, this is different from Romans, and it's also different from Ephesians. And they start looking at the various letters and saying, which Paul only wrote a certain number of these. Someone else wrote these. So these are these German Enlightenment rationalists. If they had gone to the church and asked them, why didn't anybody ever notice this before? All you Greek speakers who have been actually reading this stuff in Greek for almost 2,000 years. The church would say, oh, we understand your question. Yeah, actually, Paul didn't write any of the letters. None of these letters are authentically Pauline by your standard. What? So if you turn to the back of Romans, the final chapter, you'll see a series of greetings to people in the Roman community. Say hi to Eddie for me. My brother Ted sometimes goes to church there. Say hello to him, and so forth. And then the very last one is, I, Tertius, who write this letter, greet you. Romans is written by some guy named Tertius. This fraud has been foisted upon us. In the ancient world, reading and writing are two separate skills. So today, if you work for, Sony Corporation, you might, as an engineer at Sony, author this paper that says, connect diode 365A9 to sub-indicator 65247 or whatever. You hand that over to the next department, the copywriters, and they take that and they translate that into twist the wires together and stick them in the back of your stereo. So we still have this actual skill of writing comprehensible stuff. But in the ancient world, a professional writer would take your dictation and they would turn it into the appropriate format. So I might say, take a letter. All right, tell the governor I thank him for his gift, and my train arrives at 3:55 p.m., and I look forward to seeing him. And so this professional writer, this scribe, this amanuensis, would say, "Your great and reverend governor of Ephesus, John 8, whatever, all your million titles, it was with trembling that I opened the box containing your beautiful gift, and it is with joy that I think about my arrival on the train, blah, blah, blah." So they would take your sort of basic statements and turn them into the appropriate language. We know that Paul writes with an amanuensis in all of his letters, because some of them actually name the amanuensis, like Romans, and then in others, he adds a postscript in his own handwriting. And when I say others, I mean like 6 of the letters. He'll say like, "I, Paul, write this part." Look, at one point, I think it's in Colossians, he says, "Look how big I write," or "Look how large my letters are when I write with my own hand." Like he's giving this postscript saying like, "Sincerely, love, Paul." So if you did a Bible as literature class or something like that in maybe the 1990s or maybe even the early 2000s, you might hear that Paul wrote 6 of the Pauline letters. This perspective is really on the wane. So if you go to like the American Academy of Religion meeting, there will still be some seminars where people will talk in this way about disputed and undisputed Pauline letters. There will be maybe a majority of people who don't speak in those sort of clear terms anymore. So early on, Paul is not writing to construct a New Testament. Paul is just writing to churches. But we know that these are not letters that are written to individuals, with 3 exceptions. These are letters written to communities. And we also know that they're not just written only to a specific community, but they're actually meant to be shared among churches. In Colossians, he says, "Be sure to get the letter that I wrote to the Laodiceans and share this letter with them. Send this one on to another church, have them send theirs on to you, distribute these letters." So fairly early on, these letters would be read out in the context of a service. We actually still do this in the Episcopal Church. When the bishop writes a pastoral letter, it's actually enjoined upon clergy canonically. We have to get up and read it in front of the congregation, or if you happen to be one of those lucky congregations where everybody knows how to read, you can distribute it as a paper copy. But we actually still do read these epistles in the context of liturgy. So early on, these Pauline letters may have gotten added in with the Old Testament reading. But in the early church, there is no New Testament. You have the testimony of the apostles. So how did all this stuff get written and when, in terms of the actual Gospels? So there are 2 different ways of thinking about this chronology. I'll give you the old-fashioned way, and we can also talk about the also old-fashioned way that was very current in the 19th century. So we have a really interesting series of fragments from a guy called Papias of Hierapolis. And Papias is a bishop in the early 2nd century in the city of Hierapolis. He shouldn't be confused with his father, Grand Papias of No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. I'll be here all week. So Papias, we don't have his full texts preserved. I mean, we sometimes think in terms of this incredible wealth of ancient texts that have come down to us, that we have so much of what folks wrote in the ancient world. We have lost 99.999% of everything that people wrote in the ancient world. We just have these miraculous few things that have been preserved and handed off to us. So the fragments of Papias are preserved in a historian called Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius is writing in the early 330s, maybe 330, 335, something like that. But he's collecting all of this earlier work, and he's quoting it all. And so he has Papias say, he quotes him in these big block quotes, and Papias says, whenever anyone who was an apostle or a disciple, or who knew the apostles or disciples, came to my part of the world, Hierapolis, I would grill them at length. I wanted to know everything about Jesus. I wanted to know everything they remembered about the Pentecost, about the early days in Jerusalem. I wanted to know it all. And here's what I heard. So he says, the first gospel written down was the gospel according to St. Matthew, who wrote it in what he calls, in quotation marks, the Hebrew language. This probably doesn't mean Hebrew as we know it. This probably means Aramaic, the language spoken by Christ, the language spoken by the apostles. So Matthew wrote his gospel in either Hebrew or Aramaic in the city of Antioch. So for the church's dating, this is the first gospel. We'll talk about another dating system in a sec. And it was written, he says, for the Jewish people who had accepted Christ. And it's interesting to look at the Gospel of Matthew because we have, in some Gospels, like Luke, you'll have something like the ablutions that Jewish people are commanded to do in terms of washing out pots and that kind of thing. And Luke will say, it's a Jewish custom to do this thing. Matthew never says that. He doesn't give any gloss on Judaism. He assumes you know all about Judaism. St. Jerome, writing in the 4th century, said that he went to a library, I think in Caesarea, and he found a copy of Matthew's gospel in Aramaic. So he says the Hebrew language as well, but we think it's Aramaic. So we have various witnesses to kind of validate Papias's claim. We only have Matthew in Greek. We don't have any Aramaic copies of Matthew. Some scholars have done something really interesting, which is algorithmically retranslating all of Matthew into Aramaic, and sometimes instances of very odd Greek grammar actually become sensible in this Aramaic translation. Is it true? We don't know. We don't have the copy, but it's pretty interesting. Papias says that Mark was the translator of Peter. So Mark is the guy that followed around Peter, and Peter would get up in the market square and start saying something in Greek, and Mark would say, okay, slow down. Okay, what he says in Latin is this. And as Mark traveled around with Peter, he also said, this is good stuff. Somebody should write this down. And so with Peter's permission, Mark starts making transcriptions of Peter's sermons, taking down all of the events in the life of Christ. But, Papias tells us, not in order. So the early church would say, if you have conflicting chronologies between John and Mark, go with John. Because Papias says Mark didn't write these down in order. It was just as he remembered them, as he heard them from Peter. With Peter's assent, Mark, shortly thereafter, so we think Peter dies probably somewhere between 64 and 66 AD under Nero. After the death of Peter, Mark goes to Egypt. And he goes to the city of Alexandria, total outsider, doesn't know anybody, no letters of introduction. He gets off this long, tedious boat ride. He starts walking up from the docks, and he breaks a thong on his sandal. Wouldn't you know it, I'm finally here. So he goes to a cobbler's shop. And he goes to the cobbler's shop. He's sitting in the waiting room. The cobbler is fixing his sandal. The cobbler stabs himself with a needle and says, to the unknown God. And Mark says, wait, what did you say? And he said, I said, to the unknown God. And Mark says, that's exactly who I'm here to tell you about. And that cobbler shop, according to Egyptian Christians, Coptic Christians, becomes the first church in Egypt. And so the Gospel of Mark is both the Roman Gospel, because it was written where Peter was teaching in Rome, and it's the Coptic Gospel, because it was first brought to the Egyptians in the city of Alexandria. We have Luke, who kind of played a similar role, not with Peter, but with Paul. So Luke is following Paul around and assisting him. Paul, at one point, I think in Ephesians, talks about how only Luke is with me in prison. And there have been some scholars, again, who have algorithmically compared the contents and the sort of style and diction and so forth of Ephesians with the Gospel of Luke and with Acts. And they're surprisingly consistent. Was Luke the amanuensis for Ephesians? Who knows? Interesting thought. So Luke follows Paul around and writes, in a sense, the gospel according to Paul. In Acts, you hear everything described in the third person by Luke. So he'll say, they went there, they did this, they got that, they got ridden out of town on a rail, until you get to chapter 16, and then without any fanfare, it switches to first person plural. Then we stopped here, then we got on the boat, then we did this. It's the point at which Luke has joined Paul in his travels. So you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then we have John. So before I get into John, let me tell you about the other way of dating the Gospels. So I don't know if any of you have insomnia, but if you do, I can recommend the philosopher Hegel. You will be snoring all night long. Hegel held the German imagination in the early 19th century like a vice grip. You know, everyone was so into Hegel. He had solved all the problems. He knew how everything was going to happen. It was all about Hegel. And this is true not just in German philosophy and economics and so forth. This is also true in early 19th century German theology. So you have this guy, one of Hegel's biggest fans, F.C. Bauer. And Bauer starts applying Hegelian ideas to biblical studies and the development of the New Testament canon. And Bauer is not to type 19th century Germans, because I'm sure there were lots of lovely 19th century Germans. I'm sure there were, but he was wildly anti-Semitic, horribly racist, just like not a great dude in my book. And so Friedrich Christian Bauer is thinking about where the New Testament comes from. And he has this Hegelian theory of the evolution of religions. You know, Hegel's always thesis, antithesis, like you get this evolution, things progress, and so forth. So for Bauer, you have primitive, in quotation marks, religion. Primitive religion is people worshiping rocks and trees and brooks and so forth. Then you have like primitive religion by basically white guys who are good at writing. And so that's the ancient Greeks. And so you have people worshiping rocks and stones and so forth, but it's done in beautiful poetry. So that's an evolution. And then you have this other very condescending nod towards evolution in Judaism, which he still considers a primitive religion. And then you have the apex of religion, which is Christianity. But true Christianity is strictly an ethical phenomenon. It's just moral teaching. So Jesus has this new moral teaching, which is unlike anything that's gone before. So Jesus says, it's been said to you that if you cheat on your wife, you're doing something bad. But I say to you, anyone that looks upon someone else with lust is already basically doing the same thing. And Bauer says, gosh, that is a really high standard. That is an impressive morality. Just your thoughts straying into the immoral makes it something to be avoided. But Bauer says, who's going to do this? Like, that's such a high bar. That's crazy. So what the biblical authors have to do is to throw a bunch of miracles in to impress the rubes. So if I say to you, don't steal, well, you might not listen to me. But if I can, zap that window and turn it into a bunch of sandwiches, then maybe you're going to listen to me. If I can impress you, maybe you'll listen to my teaching. So Bauer has this idea that true Christianity, true, perfect, idealist Hegelian Christianity, is just a moral stance. And all the miracle stories, all the God stuff, that's just kind of thrown in to spice it up. And so the earlier the text, the more morality and the less God you have. And then as the texts go along and they need to convince more and more people not to be jerks by being impressed, they start spicing it up with God stuff and miracles, all this, basically irrelevant stuff to Christianity. So Mark, for him, has the fewest miracles and the most morality. Matthew and Luke, they're like doing a little bit better. John, it's all theology. It's all miracles. It's all this Jesus is God stuff. That must be really late. Probably like 300 AD. And it is so foreign. It is so not Jewish. It is so Greek. This is probably written by some Greek philosopher from Athens or MIT or something. Like this has nothing to do with Jerusalem. Nothing to do with Judaism. And so this becomes orthodoxy in a lot of biblical studies circles for a good 150 years. But then these jerks, these archaeologists, ruin the whole project. First of all, they discover the oldest fragment of a gospel that's ever been found. I think it's called Ryland's Papyrus 52. Guess what gospel it's from? It's John! Oh no! And it's like from 123, and it was found in Egypt. So somehow this text written by a Greek in the year 300 makes its way to Egypt and is buried in the sands in the year 123. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. Yeah, that's right. It's going to make me a more moral person for sure. And then the same jerks are digging around in a bunch of clay pots at this place Qumran, right above the Red Sea, and they find the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are as Jewish as you get. These are written a couple hundred years before Christ and up to the year 70. And guess who they read like? The Gospel according to St. John. It's the same themes of light and darkness, children of the evil one, children of the Father, all this stuff that Bauer and his crew were saying is pure Platonism turns out to be as Jewish as you get in the 2nd, 1st centuries BC, 1st century AD. So again, scholars had to rethink a lot of this stuff. Again, if you went back to the early church and asked them about this stuff, they could have just told you the story. And this is preserved in Papias, and this is preserved elsewhere, that John the Apostle, the beloved disciple, who rested his head on the Lord's breast, who stood at the foot of the cross, wrote the Gospel according to St. John as an elderly man in the city of Ephesus, probably somewhere in the mid-90s, just before his death. So you have, according to the early church, Matthew authored first, then Mark. Luke, we're not sure about the dating. Papias doesn't discuss this. Maybe contemporary with Mark, maybe before. And then John is the last gospel. So how did all these get put into one book together? How much time we got? So we have. If you watch something on like the History Channel about how the Bible was put together, they will tell you the Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in some smoky back room was like, I don't like that one. No, it's got too much women stuff in it. No, not that one either. Yeah, John's okay. And just sort of sorted them out, put them in two piles, put it together, published the book. Completely made up. That has nothing to do with the Council of Nicaea. We can say this because we have the acts of the Council of Nicaea. The meeting minutes still exist. You can Google them and read everything that happened at the Council of Nicaea. The canon is not discussed. The big things are Arianism and how we date Easter. It's not the canon of Scripture. In fact, the canon, in the form that we have it, the earliest instantiation we have of that comes from after Nicaea. I think it's 367. You have this letter from Athanasius to the people in his diocese, he's a bishop, saying, here are the books you should read in church. Even that is just for one diocese. That's not definite for the whole church. And so up through the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, different churches are using different collections, just like different synagogues had different collections of scrolls. So the formation of canon actually happens in a very organic way. It just depends on the stuff that you have. So by the 170s, Irenaeus of Lyon, great theologian, writes this almost systematic work of theology, The Prescription Against Heretics. Irenaeus says, there are now, and have always been, only 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when you look at the fathers and mothers of the early church, people in Palestine, people in Syria, people in Egypt, people in Western France, people in Gaul, people all over the place, guess which Gospels they quote? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You don't have any early church writers in the 1st century and the 2nd century quoting the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Why not? Those were seen as belonging to a different religious tradition. They were not Christian, they were Gnostic. So Gnosticism is a completely different religion, and it's not that they were trying to foist themselves off on the church as legitimately Christian. They thought Christians were a bunch of saps. They had no interest in being stuck between Matthew and Mark, these hoi polloi, dumb gospels. They had the real Gnostic truth. So in Gnosticism, there are 2 types of beings. There are people who have a divine spark, a light of God, a sacred part of God within them. And then there are garbage people. And how do you know if you have the divine spark? Do you tithe to the Gnostic church? So one pagan philosopher, a Greek philosopher, said that they were such morons. It was like if you went into a room full of normally sized people and went up to one person and said, "Did you know that you're 14 feet tall?" And they're like, "I am? Wow, that's fantastic. I'm so much taller than everybody else." That it was this ridiculous religion just based on vanity. And so the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, if you read them looking for Gnostic ideas, they're on every page. If you just read them as though they are Gospels, then it creates a lot of confusion. So these were not read in the church. The same historian Eusebius has a list of books that the churches are reading. He has a list of books that some churches read and others don't, a list of books that are definitely not apostolic but that are fantastic anyway, and then a book of texts that he says are heretical, are from really other rival religious traditions. And so the ones that some churches read, some churches don't read, the really controversial books are things like 2nd and 3rd John. Books we wouldn't think of as, not only are they not controversial, they're not even very long. 3rd John is 6 sentences or something. It's nothing. But there were some churches that had those because they had been shared with them, and some that didn't. There was controversy over John's revelation. Interestingly, the controversy was not, did St. John write this? The controversy was, shouldn't we not read this in church? Isn't this heavy stuff that's going to give people the wrong idea? Don't you have to have such deep, incredible Christian formation before coming to a text like this that it should just be something that you approach after you've been a good Christian for 85 years? And then Hebrews, because Hebrews is very mysterious and strange. There have been all these different theories in the early church around who wrote Hebrews. There was one early church theologian in the 7th century who guessed that it might have been written by the Virgin Mary. Who knows? The thing with Hebrews is, by the middle of the 2nd century, we know it was accepted as a Pauline text. Because we have this corpus of Pauline literature, the Apostolicon, all of Paul's letters put together, and Hebrews is in it. So for the early church, Hebrews was Pauline. One thing that some scholars have suggested is that Hebrews is from Paul, but it's not a letter of Paul. It's a transcribed sermon. Who knows? Interesting to think about. So the canon, to finish up for today, the canon does actually all come together. It all gets put in one book. It's signed, sealed, delivered. It's absolutely official in the middle of the 1500s. The Council of Trent is when the canon is finalized. And it's finalized not in reaction to people reading these books we shouldn't be reading in church. It's finalized in response to people like Luther, who said, let's not read James. Let's not read the Revelation. Let's leave some books out that conflict with Lutheran theology. No disrespect to Luther, who's phenomenal and an amazing theologian, but this is the reason why the Roman Catholic Church finalized their canon. Anglicanism in the 1570s finalizes our canon kind of in response to the Council of Trent. But it's not an early church phenomenon, doesn't happen at Nicaea. Questions or thoughts? To be continued.